Well, welcome everyone. My name is Marc Siciliano. I'm one of the partners at TIES, the backbone organization for the STEM Learning Ecosystems Community of Practice. Glad you're here and glad you're here to join today. For many, this conversation, why is STEM so white, is just the continuation of a lifelong conversation that you've always had. More formally, this is the continuation of a panel discussion from our virtual convening back in October, and our panel members have agreed to join us again to continue this very important dialogue. We know that there is an equity in STEM, and the system was designed that way. This didn't happen by chance. If we are to really confront it and address it and to redesign the system, conversations like today need to happen more regularly, more frequently, and we need to get comfortable having these conversations in these spaces. TIES and the STEM Learning Ecosystems Community of Practice are committed to elevating this kind of discourse and taking action. If we are to build bigger tables, more inclusive tables, we know that much work remains and we need to act accordingly. And so with that in mind, we're really excited to have this conversation today and that all of you have joined to participate in it, knowing that 2021 is all about action. For a few logistics related to today's discussion, continue to use the chat box throughout, post questions, post comments. After our panel offers some of their thoughts in response to some questions, we will open things up to question and answers, and your questions will be addressed by the panel. I would like to turn things over to Natasha Walker at this time. She's the Executive Director of Project Explorations, and she also leads the STEM Pathways Network, the Chicago STEM Pathways, the Chicago STEM ecosystem. She will moderate our discussion, introduce our panel members, and I'd like to turn things over to you, Natasha. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you everyone for rejoining us for this really important conversation. As Mark shared, my name is Natasha Walker. I'm the Executive Director of Project Exploration, and we lead the Chicago STEM Pathways Cooperative, which is Chicago's ecosystem here, obviously in Chicago. Today's conversation obviously creates a lot of questions. I think that the title alone has sparked probably conversations throughout the ecosystem and even in just sort of your conversations as you're having at home. But it's an important conversation, and we were very purposeful in this particular title. Why is STEM still white? And I know it's challenging for many of us to actually unpack that, but one of the things that we hope will happen during this conversation is that we understand the generational issues that have been challenging to Black and Brown communities around engagement in STEM and through various filters, right? So when we think about the academic sector, the corporate sector, all the various sectors that exist, there continues to be challenges around racial equity. This conversation is meant to create dialogue for us to recognize and to understand what has impacted and the challenges and barriers that maintain and continue to exist. But it also allows us an opportunity to think about what are the other things that we need to address and what are the other conversations that need to go on to help us maintain an eye on the fact that race has played an issue around STEM and how we tackle that, whether it is offering opportunities for minority youth in our programs to continue to thrive, or is it how do we actually look at the institutions that exist and what is the role that we have in making changes or understanding how systemic racism continues to persist and exist in those settings. And so this is a conversation. I anticipate that we will have an opportunity to have some robust conversation. This is an opportunity for us to have some transparency, to have some respect, and most importantly, to listen to one another. And so I'm very excited to take the time to introduce our fellow or partners. And so I also want to take time to my co-moderator, LaTrenda, that everybody should know. And so she will be coming, she would sort of help with this conversation, but she's also going to do a nice close for us. I also love to introduce Reginald McGregor, who is one of our ecosystem leaders, has been around for some time with our ecosystem conversation. And I also am really pleased to introduce Dr. Nichole Pinkard. She's an associate professor in the School of Education and Policy at Northwestern. She's also the founder of Digital Youth Network and L3, which is a social learning platform that connects youth to different opportunities. And so with that, I will love to have each of our panelists take a minute to introduce themselves and to provide a little bit of context in terms of why you came to this conversation. So why don't we go ahead and start with Dr. Pinkard and take about 2 to 3 minutes to introduce yourself and why you're in this space.
Okay. Hey everyone, and I'm so happy to be able to re-engage this conversation because I was the one with all the technical difficulties and being the computer scientist and on the panel. That was a little a blow to my ego there. So let's hopefully knock on wood, this is going to be good. So my name is Nichole. I'm a professor of learning sciences, but I come at this work truly, and if you've seen any of my work or read any of the work, I'm really involved in really just a study to understand how did I get to where I am? How is a Black girl from Kansas City, Kansas, whose parents, my mom worked for AT&T, my father worked for the utility company, who pushed me to excel. But how did I end up as a computer science major from Stanford without feeling that that was my goal? Like there wasn't a family drive to get there. And in thinking about that, how does that help me understand the work that I do to understand why STEAM is so white? And so in doing some reflection on that, to me, I think the challenge is for us to get to a point where let's say Black kids are actively engaged in STEAM from a standpoint of joy for passion, not from a standpoint of doing it because it's a school class. We need trained educators who look like them. We need content that is culturally relevant. We need parents aware. We need programs in communities that are accessible, not that you have to drive outside of your community to get there. We need all of that working together. And I think of where we are as a field right now, we have examples of each of these in place. We have great examples of quality programming. We have great examples like Natasha's work of programs that do that, but we haven't fully brought this all together. So to me, STEM is so white. That is because to enable Black kids to engage in this, you really need a fully functioning, connected ecosystem. And we just haven't risen to that body of the work yet because our studies, our research, our data, and our support is more focused at the program level, not necessarily at the systems level. And I am a kid who grew up in Kansas City that sort of had it. I didn't realize how much the system was connected, right? I had mentors and coaches for basketball. My high school basketball teacher was also the computer science teacher. My aunt had an Apple IIe and told me, Nichole, figure it out. So when I got to high school, I sort of knew what that was. So all of those connected things made it easy for me to stumble upon and stay connected to STEAM, where I think for most kids, that's not a reality. It has to be, they have to go in wanting to do it. So I think that's, to me, I'll be quiet right now. So I think the challenge of STEAM, why STEAM is so white, is because we haven't truly connected all the pieces together. But the beauty of it is, I think we have the pieces. We now just need to figure out how to connect them. Was that my 2 minutes, Natasha? Was that good?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Nichole. Reginald, same question, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Natasha. And again, thanks for everybody for being here. I see we have almost over 50 people in the chat room. So this is a topic of interest. And I think people are here to learn and to understand what it is they can do next. So again, I work at Rolls Royce Corporation, been there about 20 years. I am a mechanical engineer by trade or by training, and I oversee STEM outreach for North America. Now, back to Dr. Nichole, she made a good point. So my mother was a teacher, taught almost 30 years in elementary education. So education was just part of what, people like, it was part of our discussion, conversation. No, it was just how we lived. I knew my mother paid bills by being a teacher. So coming out of high school, that was my goal, to be a teacher. She makes a good point though. So I did not grow up saying I want to be an engineer or go into STEM. In fact, in high school, knowing I want to be a teacher, I had good grades. I didn't have a choice. My mother was, it wasn't that I was good in math and science. If I wanted to do other things, I had to have good grades. That's just a fact of life. So But the benefit of that is I enjoyed doing the work. I enjoyed math and science. I enjoyed it. But I had a guidance counselor, African-American guidance counselor, who told me, like, Reginald, there are no education scholarships, but you can go and get an engineering scholarship. I can help you get an engineering scholarship and you can teach. And just from those words, I said, okay, then that's what I do. But I didn't grow up tinkering around with cars. Like, I can't wait to solve the world. So somebody told me to go do it. And the reason I bring that up is because that conversation in the African-American community is important. Yeah, young men, they see a LeBron James. They see how they can get from one spot to another, but someone has to tell you, be intentional about, hey, go become a mechanical engineer, go become this. And with that information, they go and do that. But when you start having conversation like, well, there's some things you might want to consider. Have you thought about this, all about this? Let's think about corporate America. So I oversee STEM outreach in corporate America, right? So I deal with your big aerospace companies, Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop. We all have these conversations. So in our groups, though, in many cases, we start talking about these diversity issues. And we start having these conversations, all of a sudden everybody's looking at me. So now I am the representative of all African Americans in the country, because, as I tell Mr. Boeing, so there's nobody of color in your company who can come and talk about this. Oh yeah, that's right, Reginald. Maybe I should bring Jamal with. Maybe I should bring blah, blah, blah. Exactly. The point I'm trying to make is this. So when you look at corporate America, those companies who have funding, a lot of our ecosystem have funding tied to partnerships with corporate. But those leaders in that corporate arena, sometimes their expectation has to be changed from your conversation. So I can go out in my engineering group and look and see like, wow, there's just like one or two faces of color. Expectation is, maybe they not engineers. I go to my manufacturing facility and 60% of the population is African Americans. How is that? So what happened? How did that shift happen? Expectations from corporate America. So now you got to have that conversation of, as you sponsor or fund these programs, we're going to help you make that change in your corporate settings. That should be the conversation you should be having with us. Now, because of some of the things taking place in our country, we understand the importance of having these diverse conversations. There was a time when, in order for us to have diverse faces, we actually went to global. We had global programs in order to make us a little bit more diverse. So what does that mean, Reginald? So before I talk to Chicago, Philadelphia, New Jersey, Iowa, I'm talking to people over in Japan. I'm talking to people over in India. I'm talking to people down in Mexico. I'm talking to people in Germany. So now I have to be careful, because here I am having this diverse conversation, and yet I'm still not addressing the issues in my own country in terms of these students of color who all they need is opportunity and someone to give them the right instructions or the right conversation. You can do this. So with that said, I'm looking forward to all our different conversations here.
Wonderful. So I caught a couple things. I caught something around the human capital, right? I caught something around intentionality and expectations. I caught some conversation around what is it that we're supporting? What is it that's getting funded? How are we ensuring that what is being put out there is doing kind of the right thing that we see that is necessary for our Black and brown young people to thrive? I'm now also hearing, Reginald, some conversation around this global community. We're really thinking about what goes on outside of the United States, but what I hear you saying is we should be focused on what's going on in our, United States. And so I'd love to hear both of your perspectives around this people, the human capital, the funding, and the intentionality of what needs to happen around the barriers that have existed.
I yield my time to Dr. Nichole since she got cut off last time.
So from the standpoint of people, and I actually approach it more so from the out of school space, and I'm looking at the comments, so I'm gonna try to weave some of the stuff in here. So I think a challenge right now is that STEAM for kids of color, particularly I would say Black kids in the middle, as a as a requirement, a medicine. You got to do this. It's not stumble upon. It's not let me learn to do it. Like, you know, I want to build this robot. I want to create this thing that is culturally relevant. So I'm intentionally learning to do it. Right now, it's either part of a class or your parent is making you go someplace. And so I think what we have to then do is just figure out, I always try to, as an athlete, I use the analogy of sports. There's multiple places. If the only place I can learn to play basketball is at the school gym, I'm not going to want to play basketball. I got to be able to play at a school. I got to know that there's a community place to play it. I got to see older people playing it. And I have to have some place where I can practice without everyone watching on me. So I think as we begin to sort of say, okay, well, we think we have some courses in place. Now we begin to look at what are our, where are educators in the out of school place, and where can kids engage that? And so that work that we've tried to do, Natasha, with you leading that, is in Chicago, looking at our parks, places, and libraries that we know the cities have invested infrastructure dollars and are civically and should be equitably available, to then think about how can we bring some of the STEM programming into those places and also train their folks. So our approach now has been to say, well, we're going to grow our STEAM human capital from within the community, and be intentional about placing them in spaces that kids are comfortable coming, parks, libraries, and out of school spaces. So that's an approach that we're doing. And Natasha, you should speak to that too, because you're leading that work. So I'm calling you out to talk about it too.
Okay, this is not throw it back on the moderator conversation, but I will bring that up a little bit. Thank you, Nichole, and I will talk about that in a second. But Reginald, talk a little bit more around that notion of funding, intentionality, and the position that we need to think about as we move into, really, we are in a global space, and more so than none, COVID has taught us, has shown us that, you know, the challenges that exist because of COVID have surfaced so quickly and bubbled up so fast that we need to think about how do we make sure that our families and communities continue to be part of the process in light of COVID and the digital divide, et cetera.
That's a good point. So let's stay on this whole basketball analogy as it relates to having programs. So not only do you have to make sure that you have these programs in your schools and have programs in the gym, but as part of the ecosystem, even when that students show up at the park or show up at your community center and you realize that they don't have no tennis shoes or they don't have this, they don't have this. So as ecosystem, you have to make sure you have the right resources. Sometimes those additional resources come from corporate funding. So you tie those corporate fundings to, I am making sure that those who participate have an equal chance of participating in full. The other thing about it, let's talk about the structure a little bit. So early on in corporate America, and early on in industry, we started having these conversations about pathways and start having so how do students get to see what we do? How can they become what we can do? So early on, let's bring students in and the job shall do internships. But what we ran into was this. And I'll talk about here in Indiana, we ran into, so I have these non-paid internships so students could come see what I do. And these are high school students. Well, non-paid internships sometimes can mean if I have to do that, then that means I can't do this in my community because I have to work. So I have to work in order to be able to participate in my athletics at my school, or I have to be able to work so I can do things that help my family out. So instead of me having these non-paid internships, now I got to realize in order for me to attract students of everywhere, especially those of color, I'm going to have to pay them. And also I have paid internships. So when companies start having conversations with you like, well, you can have non-paid internships, as ecosystem leaders, you have to explain to these corporate leaders what that means and who are you making sure ensure that there's a small pool of people who can do those internships. So yes, we want them to see what we can do, but we also want to reward them so they can participate. The other question around this whole global, so this global economy, global workforce. So as a contractor, as a defense contractor, I have to have U.S. citizens. So one thing I always in our ecosystems, one thing we start talking about is those you're serving, the importance of U.S. citizenship. And keep in mind, you are competing against the world, right? As a corporation, as part of the community, that economic development in that community, I want to ensure that I bring in all communities, all walks of life to come and work for us so they can go back and impact their communities. So you start having a different conversation around just my small funding, how that impacts conversation in different communities, how that impacts education. So I'll hold it right there because I can get on that all day.
So a couple things that I heard was corporate leaders. And this is going to go to a question that I saw in the chat around what classifies systemic level change. We have a group, there's 200 and some odd people on this webinar, all have a role in ecosystems across the nation and international in some cases. Talk to us, both Dr. Pinkard and Reginald, about what it means for leaders and what are the things that you think need to happen, and how does that start to impact systemic level change, and perhaps maybe define systemic from the perspectives that you both come from. Nichole, we'll go ahead and start with you.
And so, so for me, when I think of some systemic, and particularly around issues of STEM, I try to use the word learning versus education, because I think education leads us to think much more about what takes place in school. And I don't believe that we can address the STEM gap just within the school. So we have to think about learning ecosystem, which is the whole community. So that's parks, libraries, to me, and schools. And the realization, and Natasha helped me realize this, in most communities, there is no one person or no body that is responsible for bringing together parks, libraries, and schools to talk about collectively how are they communicating to their shared audience, which are families, what they're doing, right? So the park might have a phenomenal STEAM set of activities. The library might be having their own plan, and the school. They each could be doing phenomenal things, but they're not integrated together or communicated. So for me, when I think about a system level, it's like the intentionality of bringing your stakeholders together, and also out of school, all of your CBOs and out of school organizations. And Natasha, again, has been leading this work, and I've been learning a lot from what she's been doing in the Austin community, around the table to simply ask the question, well, what are our expectations? What do we want kids to do? What program? So you have to make a decision. Do you want to do every STEM area, or are we going to focus on robotics? Or we're going to focus on e-textiles, or we're going to focus on the combination? Let's agree, and then let's just have the conversation of where are the opportunities and where can we do a better job of bringing these together. So I actually don't think it's a hard, and what I've experienced, it is not a hard shift. The minute you say, oh, okay, yeah, how do we think about this together? Here's what I got, here's what you got. Can we think about, let's intentionally do things differently than unintentionally doing them differently because we just didn't have the conversation. And so then that brings into the need for common systems. If you work in an out of school, the reality is every out of school organization can have their own policies. And so when you try to work together the policies, you got to spend a lot of time. So I think coming and trying to figure out some shared systems and practices that make it easier for folks to work together. And then the last thing I'll say then is funders. So I have been very fortunate to get funding, but I can also say that no one has ever made me justify where I place my programs. No one has ever made me say, why do I need to put it? Why? Tell me what you understand about this whole city, this community, or why you need to put it in Bronzeville versus put it in Austin, or put it in Pilsen or South Shore. I'm able to do what I want to do based on where my interests are. Hopefully no one on NSF is going to see this. And but I think that's the thing, right? So, but it's really hard. But if you think about if I'm placing a Starbucks, if I'm placing an exercise, I'm looking at some data that tells me what's my community, what they need, where's the nearest Starbucks, why do I want to place this here, right? So there's a lot of intentionality of where we place things beyond out of school. So I think if we can work together, we can do a better job of figuring out where our needs are for programming and work together to put it there. So that means funders have to think a little differently about how to fund community initiatives and not necessarily just funding the individuals who are really good at writing grants, or at least hold us accountable for where we place our programs.
Thank you.
Dr. Nichole, hey, that's a good point. Let me ask you something real quick, Dr. Nichole. So as you determine where you put those different programs, so help us understand, so why you put a program in a certain place? What are you trying to address here?
Right. So, and so I will say now that we are putting in place the data systems that allow that question. Most places can't ask that question because there is no data to allow you to ask it. In Chicago and in Evanston and in Dallas, and some work we're and partnering with Big Thought in Dallas and P16 Plus in San Antonio, collecting the historical out of school program data. So then you can map it and you can see, hey, in Austin, where Natasha is, you can say, we've only offered one robotics programming in the summer. So if I only have one robotics program there, then we can't be talking about kids wanting to engage in robotics, right? So that's where I think those systematic work needs is to be, what are we offering? Let's look at the coverage where it is, and then let's work together to figure out what we need to put there intentionally. And then that requires our funders to sort of have trust in like anchor orgs like Natasha, to say, trust that I know where things need to go in my community, right? And that we can work together with the organizations here to allocate funding in the right places at the right time. So hyper-local programming funding. That doesn't happen that much. And so people are already funded, and then they're trying to figure out how to work together as a person. We're coming to the table to figure out a holistic plan that then we can agree to work together with funding that exists. Natasha, what's your thoughts on,
Yeah, so I think that one of the things, something that you said around shared systems and practices and funding community initiatives versus just funding a program, right? I think there's value in that statement, because when you understand your ecosystem and you come to the table understanding what are your shared spaces and what are your shared practices and what are the things that are needed to supplement what you're trying to do, that is where I think systems change happens. Nichole has been talking a little bit about STEAM ambassadors, and this past summer we worked with Northwestern and city colleges to be really intentional. STEAM ambassadors was really something that came out of some work that happened early on. So this work didn't just start last year or the year before. We recognized that human capital, people that looked like the young people that we serve, needed to be elevated and supported and guided to be part of the process. We recognized that we needed to ensure that we were embedding STEAM ambassadors in communities. And we went and partnered with one of the most obvious partners to us, but perhaps not obvious to everybody, which was the Park District. The Park District spaces and places that this summer they were bringing children to, but had not the mechanics or the infrastructure to be able to support any kind of education that was STEAM or STEM related. This partnership became really powerful because we were able to hire, I don't know, Nichole was at 50, I think it was, ended up hiring about 50 or so STEAM ambassadors that ended up coming and broadcasting into parks, both from we called it a one-to-many. So one STEAM ambassador would broadcast to several different parks, or more of a one-to-one experience for our older youth. Young people logged on and worked with a STEAM ambassador, similar to this particular setting. So I think that the reason that became successful and now is becoming a systemic change, and it was very local. So right now we're working with one particular area of parks, and we're working with couple communities, and it was very hyper local. We recognized our community, we recognized who the partners were, and now that is shifting because now the parks are saying, oh, this is something that can work. And so within the system of the Park District, now the park is coming back, and we just recently got a text maybe about 2 weeks ago from our park partner saying, hey, we're ready to do this again. And so I think that that's how systemic change happens. So it doesn't happen from one place or the other. It happens from a variety of different places. Reginald, do you have some thoughts about that? And especially
let me jump in real quick. So the disadvantage of Zoom is, so you're trying to listen and you're trying to read chat. So there's some conversation on the chat room. I'm like, hey guys, I might jump here in the chat room. So the disadvantage is, so we got to hurry up and get to some of these comments and questions in the chat room, because this is good stuff. But let me jump on something real quick, just because I want to highlight this before we do that. So let's think about COVID-19, pre-COVID-19 and COVID-19 as it relates to systems. Before COVID-19, we knew there was a digital divide. Before COVID-19, we knew that there was a difference in terms of healthcare available to different communities. We knew there was programs that only certain students could participate. COVID-19 hits the United States of America. It hits us. COVID-19 doesn't care about the system. In fact, COVID-19 highlight the system. So now certain communities, have been screaming for years for, we need our students to have access to Wi-Fi. That's not the new. COVID-19 hits, now all of a sudden we can put resources over there. So now actually some students of color have benefited because of COVID-19, because the crisis crumpled, it highlights the barriers of the system. Does that make sense? So now all of a sudden, I've been asking for better Wi-Fi connectivity in a certain community. In the last 5 years, COVID-19 hit, it takes us less than 10 days to get that over there. COVID-19, because it doesn't, right? Here's the other thing. Pre-COVID-19, people always talk about family engagement. So you have some students who participate. I use sports analogy. You have some kids who parents drop them off or pick them up after school. They're not sitting there at the practice, not every game, because they're working. Both parents working. COVID-19 hits. You got doctors and nurses working, lawyers working. Now all of a sudden you understand the impact of, it's not that these parents don't care. They working. COVID-19 highlights, it affects all students. So, and here's what I'm trying to point out. As you're looking at this whole system through the lens of COVID-19, this has been in place in these Black and brown communities for years. So we cannot allow this moment to pass and not make some changes to the areas where it has hit the most. We just cannot allow that to happen. Because the reality is, because of everything that took place with the highlight of George Floyd, COVID-19, now we even open to having this conversation. We've talked about this. We've talked about this in our ties, in our community practice before, and it was just kind of like a little subgroup talk about it. And I just encourage all those in the chat room, as you're asking questions, get your questions answered so we can have an impact and make some changes. But man, it's some good conversations that we need to get to. So I yield my time. Thank you.
Keep us moving. So my final kind of question that I'm going to pose to our panelists really comes from this notion that we are calling things out, right? For years, we've tried to call things out. We've attempted to call things out. But Reginald, to your point, COVID has done nothing better but to call things out and make things very transparent and put it out in the open. The reality is the reality, right? Kids are having to figure out how to do remote learning. Parents, whether you are, low income or an engineer, are needing to manage and juggle that. And Wi-Fi should be something that everyone expects to have in their household. All of these things have kind of come out. And so one of the questions that I have that for you to share your thoughts to ecosystem leaders is, who are you as an ecosystem leader in the context of this work? And what is it, what work needs to be done moving forward? And so this question really comes to folks that are sort of having this conversation about, well, we work in rural America, or we work in, an urban setting. So I'd really love to get your thoughts on, what is, who are you in the context of this work, and what work needs to be done from your particular time and space within this work?
That's wow, Natasha.
She threw that in on y'all. Y'all got to understand, we didn't know that question was coming. So we both sitting here like, who am I?
Good question, though. That's a question we like. Could be in the chat as you're like, who am I in this space?
And I think
so.
Go ahead, Reginald. I'll let you go.
So let me tell you who I am in this space. In this space, I need to make reference to a Dr. Nichole. I need to make reference to a Dr. Nichole, and I need to show a picture of Dr. Nichole, and I need to be able to call a Dr. Nichole in this space. Again, because as I am talking about this work, I need young people and others to see that this work is being done by some exciting and smart researchers that look like them. Mm-hmm. That's part of who I am in this space. Also in this space, I'm the voice of when things don't look like, wait a minute, hey guys, we're in here talking about students of color, and it's 25 of us in here, and I'm the only person in this room. Something wrong with this. So something wrong. I have to be that voice. I'm also the person who also helped to understand some of the reasons why, I call it some of the reasons why students do not participate. There's just some things that happen that you don't understand takes place in our community. After school, I have to go home and take care of my mom. I have to go home and take care of my little brother and little sister. I want to be at the robotics club, so I had to do some things, as back to Dr. Nichole, put the robotics program in my community so I can walk there and be able to get back to my house or whatever the case may be. I have to be that voice. And then I also have to be that voice of all setting expectations. You do not have to lower expectations, but because we're talking about students of color, I'm part of that voice of making sure we're going to hold them to the same regard we hold all students. That's who I am in this space.
And I'm going to throw in, and not only are we going to hold them, but we're also going to provide them with all the resources, tools, materials that any young person that can go pay for a $2,000 program should be able to get, because it's an experience.
Correct.
Throw that in there.
I think I love your answer, Reginald. And actually I love the question, because I think I personally over the last couple of weeks have been really trying to understand and be very clear and strategic about how I want to show up. Like, my work is showing up in multiple ways, but how me, Nichole, want to really focus my effort and energy around this space of how do we move forward. And for me, I think where I show up is really wanting to make sure that we keep more like a futuristic view, futuring that we don't, I think as we have to understand the historicity of where we are and what got us here, and hold systems accountable and change the systems, as we're looking in the past to understand that, right? And to me, to be honest, a lot of that is work that I think white people need to do. I want Black folks and to be hyper focused on envisioning the future and focus on developing our skill sets of where we need to be. And that oftentimes in the effort of trying to address the, to say, hey, this stuff is wrong, we can hyper focus and spend so much of our time on the past and not developing the skill sets that we need in the future. So how to do both and how to make sure that we're holding our youth, our communities, our parents, and we're holding ourselves accountable for making STEM relevant to us in our own way. Not having to own someone else's definition of it. We're doing STEAM and STEM all the time, every day.
Right.
And so let's claim it. We don't need for someone else to claim it. Let's claim it. And I think what has happened, and the last thing I'll say about this is, I got so much courage when I saw, not courage, but so much like we're on the right track when I saw, and I said this before, when I looked at Versus and I saw Erykah Badu and Jill Scott, and there was 900,000 people on a Instagram looking at a debate. And I'm like, so we have the infrastructure. To your point, the pandemic has made us address some of our infrastructure issues. So we are connected in some ways. Yep. And so now we really have to think about the creative ways to use that connection to make STEAM not seem like a medicine, but to seem like something that people want to do. And think about Black Panther. When Black Panther was out, if we had our,
that's a good point.
It was coming out. So from a system standpoint, if we knew Black Panther was coming out and about a year ahead of time, what could have happened?
Right.
Of being prepared with all the programs, everything, when everyone said, oh, Wakanda, I want to do X, what we could have done. And so now that's what I'm talking about. How do we do what we need to do, put in place the work while we're also addressing these historical issues in the systems that are holding us back?
Thank you both. I have one final piece before I'm going to turn it over to LaTrenda to see if she wants to field any questions, if we have any time to have a little bit of dialogue. But what are the pieces or nuggets of advice or recommendations, or here's something that you should think about when you're working at your local context that both of you would want to offer to all 200 people that are on here?
Let me jump in real quick to a conversation taking place in the chat room. Really, we talk about opportunity. So you are looking to be the person that if I wasn't here, then this person wouldn't have that opportunity. Mm-hmm. Or if we didn't do this, these people here don't have that opportunity. Or if we don't have this funding in place, this opportunity cannot exist for this particular group of Black and brown kids. Mm-hmm. So, and I say that because just like Dr. Nichole talked about. So the formal education system is in place. We know that, certain schools sit in certain communities are better than certain schools sit in others. So those students, get on the bus and they come into those classrooms. Now, what takes place in the classroom, we had to talk a little bit about teaching. We talk about that little different education. But in your ecosystem, you can provide opportunities 7 days a week somehow. And as you begin to provide these opportunities, be intentional about, wait a minute, am I providing an opportunity to somebody that I did not provide to yesterday? Mm-hmm. And as you meet with your staff, you start having conversation about how are we providing opportunities tomorrow that we didn't do today. It's really about opportunities around this whole STEM, achievement, education, learning opportunities. That's to me, that's what we're talking about.
Opportunities, and then I think expectations or models of what participation looks like. So again, if you think about, I'll use sports again, when Tiger Woods, when people realized his father, when Black America realized his father developed him, when the Williams system, their father developed him, we went to the golf course, we went to the tennis courts because we thought we saw it was possible, right? Correct. So the opportunities need to exist, but we also have to give the milestones, achievable milestones, and the game plan of how do you engage, and how do you engage as a family, and how do you have set expectations of what participation looks like. If you say my kid is going to play basketball, I understand they need to practice, what that looks like. If you tell me my kid is going to do robotics, I don't know what that looks like. Do I just send them to Saturday? Do I need to get a Legos kit? What is it that I need to be doing at home? And so we need to layer in the supports that can support families and kids engaging and extending the learning experiences. So we're doing a phenomenal job of providing in the programs, but we haven't figured out how to extend the program experiences into the homes.
I love that. So I really love this opportunity with expectations, models of what it should look like, but also the nuts and bolts, right? The actual tangible. Families most likely know if my kid wants to play basketball, here's what I'm going to do. Families don't know if my kid wants to be part of a Lego League robotics team, what do you do? Right? And so how do you make sure that you create opportunities of accessibility and that structure to provide that? Go ahead, Nichole.
Besides, and a shared calendar. If I'm playing sports, so again, I was a basketball fanatic, played everything in my life until I got to college was around basketball and the schedule of that. We knew the schedule. So I knew when things worked. Do you have a shared STEM calendar? So as a family can say, okay, well, we're going to do robotics in the fall and in the spring, we're going to do this, and I can plan it around my sports schedule. So I think part of what, from a systems level, is how do we holistically provide parents with an understanding of and kids, and then help them understand how to place those into their already existing portfolio of experiences. So we have some folks here in Evanston. In Evanston, sports are really important, right? And so when you play a sport, you're practicing Monday through Thursday. So we would have girls in our digital divas and they would disappear, right? But I didn't know their sports schedule. So had I known their sports schedule, right, I could say, oh, this 10 weeks, they're gonna be playing basketball. So here's the way I want the family to stay connected, right, while they're playing sports. So I think these are the sort of things we can begin to do. And I will say one of the best people in doing this is Natasha. So at some point, if we have another conversation, Natasha, you're gonna have to get out of the moderator's seat and into how do you do those small connections that keep kids connected to programs. When one stops, how do you bring them back to the next one?
I find some good partners like you, Nichole, so I'll leave it at that. All right, LaTrenda, do you want to do a little bit of a, sort of a summary, and then we can see if there's any questions. We've got a little bit, about 15 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, the chat is hype with a lot of different things, and so we're grateful for everyone participating in this conversation. I do have a couple of wrap-up thoughts that I did want to share. A number of you may have heard a few of these things while we were at the conference. I have a number of other things that I want to share. And so STEM is so white for a number of reasons, okay? One, we don't address the institutional racism that plagues our classrooms, the one that only allows certain students to have the preparation needed for the culturally biased SAT tests, and those that make available advanced placement exams for kids within certain tax brackets. Did you know some of the world's greatest Black scientists, engineers, chemists, doctors came from historically Black colleges and universities? You know, these are some of the most funded and underfunded institutions today. And we have counselors and educators in formal and informal learning spaces that don't even take the time to get to know what these environments offer, so they can't even share it with their students. A Johns Hopkins University study found that having one Black teacher in elementary school significantly increases the likelihood that that Black student will graduate. Hence, the impact is particularly acute for low-income Black boys, but very little districts and institutions make a commitment to achieve on this.
That's a good point.
Speaking of teachers of color, while Brown versus the Board of Education banned segregation in America's education system, it also had an unintended consequence as shared by Education Week, the effects of which are still felt today. It caused the dismissal, demotion, or forced segregation of many experienced, highly credentialed Black educators who staffed Black-only schools. After this decision, tens of thousands of Black teachers and principals lost their jobs. And white superintendents began to integrate schools and balked at putting Black educators in positions of authority. We come to conferences and conversations like this, and we refuse to say racism, we refuse to say white privilege. Instead, and I saw it in the chat, I don't know why I'm choking now that I'm talking, I've been quiet this whole time. Instead, we say things like SEL, broadening participation, or parental engagement, because we can't call things what they are. And we don't even acknowledge science's roots in perpetuating the stereotypes that exist today. Oh, Lord, y'all. Richard Purcell, one of the few Black professors at Carnegie Mellon University, speaks to his students about how science and pseudoscience has given rise to stereotypes of Black people that we see today. Science once said that Black people were, inferior. Petrus Camper, an 18th century Dutch professor of anatomy, believed that the ancient Greeks have come closer than any other people to human perfection. He used Greek statuses to establish standards of beauty and ranked human faces by how closely they resembled this idea. A German scientist coined the term Caucasian in 1795 to describe the variety of mankind that originated on the southern slopes of the Mount Caucasus along Europe's eastern border. He claimed it was the original race and therefore the most beautiful. Samuel George Morton, an American anthropologist, theorized in the mid 1800s that intelligence is linked to brain size. After measuring a vast number of skulls from around the world, he concluded that whites have larger skulls than other races and therefore are superior. So we don't even acknowledge any of these truths ever when we come to conversations like this, right? The other thing that we do say is that, I live in a rural area and most of the students in my region are white. So diversity doesn't really exist. Well, what happens when those students go off to an institution because they were cultivated in a homogeneous environment? They go off and perpetuate the same racist stereotypes because an educator chose not to teach them about racism, chose not to talk about Black, continues to say minorities or women and minorities. I hear that all the time when I come to these conversations, and I didn't know women were separate from minorities. I thought it was all together. We don't do outreach appropriately. We know we live in these areas, and we could have, Black, Brown, Indigenous individuals to come to the conversation, or they don't live so far. What are we doing to support them, to bring them into our ecosystem, or to have them lead something that's happening in our ecosystem? Because maybe they don't need our help, but they could use a little bit of elevation. And lastly, we don't do our own internal work. By now, if you haven't read White Fragility or How to Be an Anti-Racist or any of those books ever since the George Floyd shooting or killing, or murder, you are behind. So you should do that. And there are more things that you can probably do by now. There are lists on Pinterest, on every single social media network, and even Google has reported more searches for things that people want to do to not perpetuate racism. So pick one and do. I think I'll share with you, I'll put in the chat. This is 11 characteristics of white supremacy culture. Many of us are in spaces where we perpetuate so many different things. We get defensive, right? When we see a comment that says, why is Sim so white? Like, we get super defensive. Why is that? Why is that? And so if you can check yourself and think about the 11 characteristics of white supremacy culture, I just put it in the chat, and just think, when I'm going into a room, what am I perpetuating? What am I doing? Right? And then we can think about the systemic changes that we can make, because we can shift our perspective. And that's it. I'm done. I don't know.
Thank you, LaTrenda. Appreciate that. Mark or Veronica, I don't know if you want to field any questions for the panel.
You covered a lot of them. So first and foremost, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for such a great job moderating, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for this really thoughtful and engaging conversation. As many of you have said, the chat is going crazy. I think you covered a lot of the questions that had come up as they had come up along the way. I know folks were looking at the chat and speaking. In the last 6 minutes, perhaps we can address sort of these two questions. You know, what is it, and I know you sort of asked this, but what is it that ecosystems, perhaps this is a summary of what was discussed. What can ecosystem leaders really start doing today, whether it's reading books like White Fragility or reaching out to non-traditional partners? What is one to, two takeaways that folks can take away from this webinar? And then perhaps if the panelists and yourself, Natasha, can just let us know what are the next steps from here as a community of practice? What do we want to do together to continue this conversation and this work?
Great. Yeah, I think that all the things that you recommended make sense, Veronica. I think that the tidbits of pieces of information that I feel have come out is, number one, really become much more informed. I think it's really easy for us to make assumptions about what racial equity looks like and what it can mean for various communities. And so I think we need to become much more cautious about making those assumptions and really learning more. I think LaTrenda's point around what does it look like when you do work in a homogeneous community? What are the things that you need to think about as you are working with young people or community or funders or institutions? I also think that understanding your ecosystem, understanding your shared systems and practices are really important. And I think the final piece that I'll reflect on is systemic change happens not from on top, but it really does have to be a groundswell. And when you create opportunities for groundswell and demand within your communities, with your parents, with your kids, with your workers, that's when systemic change really starts to make some things happen. Nichole, I think you wanted to jump in.
No, I was just wanted to highlight the point, the part of what I think, just to make sure people get this. Black kids by nature are learning how to understand the white culture, right? That's what we call code switching, right? And so all we're saying, everyone needs to understand all different cultures, right? And it shouldn't be, so we can come together and collaborate and figure ways forward if we understand each other. So it's just saying the same way that, Black kids and Hispanic kids, Latina kids we understand our culture, but it's on us to understand, Caucasian culture, or I don't want to say American Caucasian culture. And we're just saying the same thing needs to happen so we can come to a common place of figuring out our way forward together.
Great, thank you. All right, with that, it's been a great opportunity to share with all of you. LaTrenda, thank you for being my partner in all of this. Dr. Pinkard, Nichole, thank you for taking the time to come back and join us despite all the challenges that we had during our convening. So we're just grateful that you had the opportunity to come back and see us. And Reginald, you know, we of course embrace your leadership, your thought leadership during all of our
join this community. Natasha, you got to keep me in this community. I like it. So
okay, we're keeping you in the community. I got that now. All right,
Natasha, I got to jump in real quick. So given all the energy in the chat room, we have to somehow continue this conversation. I don't know what that looks like, Veronica, Mark. I don't know how do we set up another call somehow, and maybe just kind of like have a moderator just field some of these questions. But I think some people have some very interesting ideas, questions that needs to be answered that some other people had those same questions. So can we just kind of talk to what the next steps could look like? Is there another webinar? Is there something we're going to do in January? Let's be intentional about what we're going to do next.
Well, I mean, I don't want to put all of you on the spot, but we'd love to have you back if you're willing and able to continue the conversations. I think, you know, we're able on our ecosystem end to do what's helpful. So perhaps this chat is probably one of, I would say, in the history of ecosystem webinars, one of the most lively, if not the liveliest. So people have things to say. Would it be useful for us to do a quick follow-up survey with folks who have joined the webinar?
Absolutely.
I know we really plan to continue this conversation in 2021. And based on the survey results, perhaps we schedule something else. Is that fair? I mean, what do folks want to see? I'm looking in the chat. A survey sounds like it's helpful. People are asking for more. There's overwhelming thanks to all of you as well, so we can't say that enough. Conversation must continue. Okay. So we'll find some ways for folks to engage and start to collect some of that information. People are requesting breakout rooms, perhaps. So.
Yep.
Does that sound okay to everybody?
Veronica, maybe Veronica, if we do something, we could do an opening and think about through the survey, gather what kinds of things we should do in breakout rooms. I think that would be good. Perfect. And I also would welcome and challenge folks that are on this call to step up. I think that there's a lot of valuable, valuable thought leadership from a whole bunch of other people that are on here. And so it'd be great to hear if anybody's interested in also joining and helping to lead this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Natasha. Absolutely. We definitely want to hear from all of you. So even outside of a survey, if there are things that come in, the info at STEM ecosystems, or you can respond back to the emails that you're getting to register to this, we'll collect some of that data as well to put it together. So you got a shout out, LaTrenda, specifically for your research and the mindset shift. So thank you for that. And also too, thank you for your great comments in the chat. Natasha, if you are speaking, you are muted.
Oh, I wasn't, don't worry.
All right. Well, I think we're at time now. So thank you again to all of our panelists. I don't know if anybody has final words. Otherwise, we just thank you again and again for your time and dedication to this work. And we will see you soon.
Hey, feel free to share my information, contact information. Yep. Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Reginald won't give you a car, so you can.
I don't have a car to give.
At Rolls Royce, he will not give you a car. I've tried, y'all, for all of the people. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. So, thank you. Everybody, be safe. Thank you.
Take care.